Hi everyone, this is Dr. Matthew Joby. I'll be teaching your course on Introduction to Child Counseling. And in this first chapter, we're looking at the topic Introduction to a Child's World. And this chapter does an excellent job, as you'll see, at providing some structure, some background information to understanding the child's world, the world in which American children live in. Where I think the chapter lacks, I think can be supplemented by a wonderful book. And that book is by Carol Klein. It's called How It Feels to Be a Child. Now, this book is difficult to find, but if you can find it, I highly recommend it. It's one of the best books I've read on the experience of being a child, how it feels to be a child. I think it was published later under a different title, but I was given this book as a gift by a mentor psychologist. It was popular. The book was popular as she was doing her training sometime between the 1960s and the 1980s. And the book is just so good at giving a phenomenological reminder of what we felt like to be children and how it feels to be a child. I think this book will really supplement the kind of maybe sterile facts that you're going to get from this textbook chapter. So I would definitely get the book, How It Feels to Be a Child, and really explore that book. Another resource that you might want to look into are the Winnicott lectures on the BBC. Let me see if I can find these for you. Any of the books by Winnicott, Donald Winnicott, BBC lectures. Winnicott did a series of radio programs in the 1940s, and it's just an excellent series of radio programs for parenting that will give you a great deal of insight into the life of the child. And even though these recordings were made in the 1940s, they're essential to understanding, again, the world in which a child lives. And even though this world that Winnicott's talking about was 1940s, 50s, and 60s in England, the world in which a child lives remains consistent relative to the world in which an adult lives. So I think these are really important resources. And of course, you can do your own literature search and explore. I would just warn you against only relying on this textbook. There will be many supplementary ideas that I'll offer to you along the way. But let's take a look at what this textbook has to offer. I selected a few things from the chapter to discuss with you today, to look into a little more deeply. I would say a broad overview of this chapter is important, and knowing what you're going to get out of this chapter is outlined here. It's also outlined in the beginning of the book. We're going to look at children in the United States, a little bit of an outline of how children were viewed by adults through history. I'm going to look at some of the common problems, how they're categorized, that children are facing. We're going to talk about the concept of well-being, talk about the concept of resilience, define what it means to be a counselor, and take a look at other different areas of the helping professions with children. Because of course, this is a course on counseling, and it's quite different than, say, pediatric psychiatry or even pediatric psychology, child psychology. So counseling, we're going to define what that actually means in comparison with others. So firstly, let's take a look. Your book has more than enough discussion of the different agencies that exist throughout the world for assessing the state of childhood in the United States and in other countries. It turns out that the state of childhood in the United States is not at the top, the best place to grow up. It's actually pretty low. There's problems in the United States that are far more pronounced than in other cultures. And so I would offer to you, if you have the opportunity to travel, that is a great way of understanding. Often people who don't travel fall under the assumption that this is the best system in the world. And when you travel, you come to see that there are strengths, of course, and there are many weaknesses, things that other cultures seem to have gotten right that we struggle with. So I recommend, if you can, travel as much as possible. If you can't travel as much as you can, then read and watch programs on the different cultures, different areas of the world, different studies on understanding how things are done in different cultures. This is the next best thing to traveling, is tune into Rick Steves on PBS and really get a sense of what other cultures have to offer us. The Children Defense Fund in 2014 puts out some recommendations that politicians, elected officials, should really focus on. Some obvious things like ending child poverty, guaranteeing health and mental health care for children. It's not guaranteed. It's guaranteeing that will be provided. Providing high quality child care options. These are all aspects in places such as Finland are at the top of the world in providing care for young vulnerable young children of every family across the board. It's very worthwhile looking into that Nordic approach, the Finnish approach to child rearing. Ensure every child reads on a grade level by the 4th grade and guarantee quality education to every child through high school, and invest in prevention programs and stop child exploitation. As you'll see here, these are all things that are involve government programs. Taking a look at the history of how children were viewed. In the earliest time, we're talking going back to the 17th century, that's the 1600s, and even into the 1700s. Children were viewed mostly as servants or as workers for the family. The farm needed to run, so you had more children to help run the agricultural business, etc. In the 1800s and 19th century, childhood began to be viewed as a special part of life. And this came through a lot of philosophical writings, Friedrich Nietzsche, Rousseau, just to mention a few, really focused on childhood, on the childhood experience. The idea of childhood is something distinctly different from adulthood, something that we might not have quite a grasp on now, because it seems so obvious to us that childhood is distinctly different from adulthood. And then along with this, in the end of the 1700s, we began to see a focus on mental health concerns rather than locking a mentally ill person up in a room or even in the basement in a cage in some instances. Asylums started to become established, and sanitariums, and places where people would live. Today we have group homes. In the early 20th century, we saw great movement in the United States on child labor laws and also mandatory schooling and education. Up until that point, there was children were put to work in factories, and you might be interested to go on to the Internet Archives of the Library of Congress and look at some of the great photographs that are available of children workers in Newark in the early 20th century. And it was a group of photographers who were interested in bringing child labor to the attention of public officials and having something done about this. These photographs of boys 8, 7, 6, 9 years old selling newspapers or working in a factory. A lot of these images led to child labor laws and mandatory education being enacted. When we talk about child psychology, two of the most important are Sigmund Freud and his daughter Anna Freud. Of course, Anna Freud is really the child psychologist, the beginning of child psychoanalysis. So any of her books and writings on child psychology are very important, and I would encourage you to go to the library and check them out. Learn as much about Anna Freud as you can. So I'm going to be mentioning throughout our course people who may or may not be discussed in depth in your textbook. And my goal is to bring to you not only the information that your textbook, that you can read in your textbook, but also information that I can bring to you from my experience. What causes children's problems? Well, one of the big cause of problems in childhood is a changing world. We have changing American home, the structure of the home. We have different social, societal issues going on, and we have changing values. So you are all very aware that probably from the generation between you and your parents, or the generation between you and your grandparents, show a lot of changing in values. So much has changed in the past 50 years that I've been alive. My childhood was quite different than the childhood that relative socioeconomic class people or children are encountering today. So we have changing values. Things that are acceptable today would have never been acceptable 50 years ago, even 25 years ago. And some of these things may be viewed as positive changes. Others can be viewed as negative changes. Very rarely is it strictly positive or strictly negative, but I think that if we begin to think about these societal changes in a pragmatic way, a practical way, and not in a judgment of good or bad, we tend to have more value in them. So always asking ourselves the question about a value, whether or not the end result of that value is one which brings you closer to or farther away from healthfulness, is a good way of pragmatically looking at those values. If the value, if one has the right to do something, that's fine. You might choose that it's not in your best interest to do it. So these are subtleties that we discuss here. Values of society, because just because it's accepted doesn't mean it's going to be in your best interest or your child's best interest. Social crises, societal crises, things going on in society, such as the cost of higher education, the cost of groceries, the cost of healthcare. These are all very big issues that cause problems with children. And again, as you'll find in your text, and this sometimes is a startling awakening to college students, but there are societies who have figured out the problem and how to deal with it. And our society, as far as healthcare and things of this nature, doesn't seem to be one of those societies. And finally, here in the changing world, the American home. When I was growing up 50 years ago, the majority of my friends had in the small town in the mountains of Pennsylvania where I grew up and eventually returned to as an adult. Most of my neighbors and friends were married, mom and dad with a child. Most of them had working father and mother that stayed at home. Some of us had working father and mother. We could see from family to family the two-income homes versus the one-income home. Now, this is my experience. Your experience, this was my experience growing up in the 70s and the 80s in the American home. Your experience would have been growing up more recently in different demographic, perhaps. And this is just illustrating how the American home has changed relative to one's demographic area, one's socioeconomic area, etc. So ask questions. I would speak to my great-grandmother when she was alive, my grandmother, my mother, my father, my grandparents, grandfather and grandmother, and I would hear what the world was like, what this town was like, what their life was like growing up. And I encourage you to do the same thing because it'll help you to understand children today, your childhood not only, but children today and what they're dealing with and how these changes, change is not always progress, and progress is not always positive. So again, I want to get away from this idea that just because something changes or something progresses, that it's good or bad. I think we need to look at it in a more pragmatic view, like William James, American psychologist William James, encourages us to do, and ask a simple question: is it working? The American home, what's needed? Warm, loving, stable home. Varied family constellations. This means multiple generations present. Well, we're going to find out in this course that one of the biggest factors of childhood well-being is the presence of grandparents. Now, of course, if you have making one-size-fits-all statements is always dangerous. So let me give the caveat. Obviously, if you have a troubled grandparent or a toxic relationship with that grandparent, that might not be right for that child. But generally speaking, children who have more family members available, a larger family constellation, tend to be more resilient, tend to be better off growing up into adults. The American home in the changing world, complex responsibility of parents. Like I said, even going from a family where both parents work or both parents have professions to a parent family child situation where one parent is devoted to that child or those children, to caring for the children. The question of sending to daycare rather than having a family member care for the child, etc. These are all very complex responsibilities and questions that I think ultimately parents need to really ask themselves. And it seems, based on the ecological validity, it seems that a safe kind of heuristic is this: those first 5-6 years of life are essential. I mean, really essential in the foundation of who we are. And even if for those first 4, 5, 6 years of life, if a sacrifice in income and lowering the overhead, if a sacrifice in income can be made and instead put the time and resources of a dual income family into really nurturing one parent with that child in those first 6 years of life, the evidence suggests that that's a very wise move. Resources are important, of course. Excessive resources do not seem to be important, but what is important is in those first 6 years of life, a really high focus on the child's well-being. Look at societal crises that you might encounter with your child clients, conflict, gang-related, school shootings, all these things, poverty, and in certain areas of the world, refugee camps, war, terrorism, things of this nature. So these are all societal crises that affect children. And changing values. Of course, we have lifestyles and sexuality, gender, drugs, ethical and moral issues. We have, in the United States, we have quite a diversity of attitudes on values, from extremely conservative to extremely liberal, and all of the varieties in between. And if I could make an observation that I have made in my 50 years here, and to be more accurate, my 49 years here, 49 years here, I'm almost 49, and speaking with my parents, my great-grandparents, my grandparents, what I can offer you is the idea that things have become more complicated. Things were much clearer and much easier for even the generation of your parents, and gradually things have become more complicated, more complex for children. And mostly this has to do with not only rapidly changing technology, but also the fact that we have very few unifying narratives, very few unifying ethical and moral narratives. In the past, we had a sense of certainty. We believed in something. If you grew up in a religious family, you believed in the doctrine of whatever the dogma of whatever that religion was, and that is how you oriented your life around that structure, that knowledge system. If you grew up in a science-based family, a family of scientists, your understanding of the world was oriented around that dogma. Remember, the word dogma means belief. Dogmatism is like ideology. It's when you believe incorrectly that your belief is the only correct belief. That's dogmatism, but dogma is just belief. So we want to acknowledge and look at the positive sides of belief. And that doesn't necessarily mean religious belief. That can be philosophical belief. It can be intellectual belief. It can be an atheist believes in atheism, believes in the absence of that religious thing. People seem to fare best when they've come to some sort of belief system that works for them and they stick with it. Children will be introduced to a certain dogma, and as they grow and get older and experience, they will choose their own dogma. The danger that we do know is when dogma becomes dogmatism, when ideas become ideology, meaning my way or the highway. This is the way it is, and this is correct. There's very little evidence anywhere for something being absolutely correct, regardless of how deeply we feel about something. So this is important to keep in mind. Try to keep your dogmatism out of your dogma and remain flexible. And these are the keys to resilience. So what are some positive social values and principles for caring each other? Some things that should be able to transcend any belief system. And that's the ideas of justice and compassion and equality, truth, and love, pursuing knowledge, it, across the board, children who are exposed to reading, diversity of reading, not only develop the essential vocabulary for articulating what they're thinking and feeling, but it's every time you read a book, it's like stepping into another person's point of view. And this is what we call empathy, the ability to see from another person's point of view. So we also know that peace, delight in life, and humanity are other positive qualities. And as adults, we have obligations to be consistent models who exhibit the positive principles for caring for each other. This is so important. Those moments when you are at on the subway train or out at the park and a child looks at you. And if you look at that child with disapproving, scornful, arrogant, belittling eyes, that child will see themselves in your reflection. And if you look at the child with loving, kind, friendly eyes, the child will see themselves in that reflection. And I think this is one of the essential lessons that I have come into contact with in life. When you're dealing with children, even on an incidental basis out in the world, always look at the child with kind, accepting, and loving eyes, caring eyes. Look at them like they're okay. It's very easy to not look at a child this way, especially if they're being misbehaving. But to be able to correct their misbehavior with an underlying gaze of kindness, compassion, and love, reminding them that they're an acorn and within them is a mighty oak, and with the help of experienced folks, they manifest into what they are becoming. Here's some interesting ideas. So, in summary, the most vulnerable young people are the young people with multiple risk factors. Imagine, this is why it becomes so difficult to say something as simplistic as violent video games causing violent behavior. No, it depends on the child. If that child has high risk factors, violence at home, unstable family, all of these poverty, things of this nature, food insecurity, being hungry, then maybe violent media is something that this child is not going to be able to handle. Other children seem to be able to handle things without too many repercussions. My suggestion in thinking about this is to keep in mind that we want to not think egoistically of the I should have the right to do this. I should have the right to play violent video games. I should have the right to like violence and guns and things like this. I think that the more responsible approach to be with this would be, I do have the right. That is true. However, what is my responsibility to others? Maybe it would be beneficial. Speaking now as someone who I'm speaking from a counseling point of view. You might find it useful to redirect certain parents and children into questioning not only their rights but their responsibilities. Yeah, so here we have some of the significant indicators for poor long-term outcomes. Not living with both parents is a significant indicator for poor long-term outcomes. Household headed by high school dropouts. A family income below poverty level. Parents without a steady job. Family receiving welfare benefits. No health insurance. These are all significant indicators of poor long-term outcomes. We need to keep a realistic point of view here and maybe stay away from the popular notion today that anything goes, everything's okay. I think that's really a disservice to be becoming cognizant of what is actually the best situation for children. So when you see these factors, these are things to look out for. It doesn't mean we're not talking cause and effect. This is a great way to understand this. We're not talking about a cause and effect relationship. So these qualities here do not cause the poor long-term outcomes for children's mental health. What these are correlations. These are indicators that typically children that have these family situations, these social situations, have trouble. The World Initiative is put forth to give a sense of how children should be treated and looked upon. And these you can review in the text. They're very important. They're more guidelines for governments of the world to live up to. Again, this is, as your textbook points out, this is one of the areas in which, unfortunately, the United States falls far behind in. Let's talk about the idea of well-being. When we're talking about counseling and bringing a child a sense of well-being, what does that mean? Well, well-being means a presence of positive emotions and moods. The absence of negative emotions, depression, anxiety, the satisfaction with life, fulfillment, and positive functioning. Thus, well-being can be described as judging life positively and feeling good. I don't agree with this. I think this is a very problematic description, a very unrealistic description of life. I'm looking out today and I'm seeing beautiful sunshine coming down. I'm recording this lecture for you now on a spring day, long before you'll be listening to it. When you listen to this, it'll be in the middle of summer. But right now I'm looking out the window and I'm seeing bright, beautiful sun. And just yesterday it was rain and heavy, dark clouds all day. We need those dark, heavy clouds. Those rains that come down are the soil in which we grow as flowers. The idea that we should be shooting for a presence of positive emotions all the time, the absence of depression and anxiety emotions all the time, I think is unrealistic. I would say that a more healthful way of approaching this than what's being presented in the textbook. This textbook definition of well-being is accurate. It's also a bit cliche and unrealistic of the human experience. In Buddhist psychology, in the Eastern texts, we find the symbol of the lotus flower. These lotus flowers grow in water. And what's the symbolism of this? Well, if you go out on a lake in a canoe or a boat and you see these beautiful lotus flowers coming up, these lily pads, and you look down, they're growing out of muck. Out of the muck and darkness and deep struggle and torment of the gray, stormy, anxiety-depressed days grows the beautiful, positive flower. Do you see this? Well-being is not avoiding depression and anxiety. It's embracing depression and anxiety. That would be my take on this offering of the textbook. So instead of saying well-being can be described as judging life positively and feeling good, I would say well-being is described as embracing the cloudy days in appreciation of the sunny days. Here are some, your authors of the textbook offer some indicators of well-being: continuing nurturing relationships, physical protection and safety, experience tailored to individual differences for each child's optimal development, developmentally appropriate opportunities. So it's enriched environments, motor skills, and language. And I don't see music here, but my goodness, is that important. Adults who set limits, provide structure, and guide by having appropriate expectations, and a community that is stable, supportive, and consistent. Some important things here. Number one, across the board, ecological validity, and also all of the quantitative statistical research tells us. So qualitative and quantitative. When I say ecological validity, I mean life experience. One of the most important things, or maybe the most important thing a child can have, is one solid nurturing relationship. Without that, there's little hope for much else. One solid nurturing relationship, the relationship where they can always depend on that person, not always get what they want, but always depend on getting what they need. And what they need is not always what they think they need, especially with children. What they need is not always what they want. As a matter of fact, helping the child to understand that you are coming from a place of distance, of wisdom, of forethought, where they might be seeing now, you're seeing 10, 20, 15, 30 years from now. Children and young people don't tend to think long term. They think short term. So nurturing relationships that are consistent don't always give them what they want, and they don't always like you, but they know they can rely on you. Physical protection and safety. This is very much like Maslow's idea of the hierarchy of needs. Need to feel safe, need to not feel they're going to be bullied or hurt or inside or outside the home. And also understanding there's no one-size-fits-all approach to children. Parents love to compare siblings, can't do it. Each sibling, you and your brothers and sisters all have different parents. It's being able to understand that what works for the brother might not work for the sister. What works for one sibling might be a horrible experience for the other sibling. Offering enriched environment, the encouraging children to have a varied exposure to music and arts and different athletic pursuits. Really getting out, bringing children to museums and day trips if you can't have the resources or the practical ability to travel in the world. Exposing them to a library is as beneficial. Going to different local day trips around here, to different cities, the different towns, exploring local history, all these things. Reading, learning an instrument. These are all very, very important indicators of well-being. And of course, that we see here, the final two I think we've discussed here. Adults who set limits and provide structure is much more beneficial to a child than one who indulges them with everything they want. Oftentimes, parents misunderstand caring and kindness and love and with what we call enabling. So we have to know that oftentimes, actually, not just sometimes, oftentimes setting limits is the most loving thing you can do. Here's a nice definition of resilience, what we are after. This is in your text. Resilience is something that is cultivated. When you look out and you see the child and you see children who have these positive qualities, they learned those qualities. They were taught these qualities. Concentration, ethics, morality, decision-making. Some children pick them up more quickly than others, but these are all taught not just through the lessons of the mouth, but more importantly through observation. Children mimic what they see at home. It's funny, when I think about the few years that I spent being a therapist with young people, and my specialty was adolescents, so a little older than children, but subsequently I spent a lot of time using these skills of child counseling in my music teaching business profession. I hate to call it just a business, but it's a profession, and I have young children come in, and I use a lot of my counseling skills with those children because I do realize that I'm teaching them much more than how to play an instrument. There's something bigger, longer lasting going on when you teach a child the importance of grit and structure and how to approach a problem, how to solve a problem. So resilience. When you teach a child resilience, you teach them social competence, problem solving, autonomy, and a sense of purpose. Sense of purpose and autonomy. So this is a sense of purpose is, at least right now, why am I here? What am I here to do? And autonomy is, how am I going to do this? This is the difference between answering the question, what can you do for me? How can you help me? And asking the question, said, what must I do to help myself? This is what we're looking for. Environmental characteristics that support positive resilience: caring and supportive, high expectations, and opportunities for participation. So when we're looking at child counseling, we broadly look at these things in three different categories. We have the preventive services, the supportive services, and the rehabilitative services. There was a great psychoanalyst named Wilhelm Reich who wrote a great book in the 1927, I believe, called Character Analysis. I think it was published in 1932 in English. My years might be off, but you get the general period. And R-E-I-C-H, Wilhelm Reich, his book Character Analysis, what he discusses in that book is the idea of the importance of preventive counseling, preventive psychotherapy. This is making sure that the problems don't develop. Reich famously used the analogy, once a tree is crooked, like when you see a tree growing, once it grows crooked, it's crooked for life. You can't really straighten the crooked part out. This might be this is an interest. It gives us a lot to think about. But what Reich is actually getting at is the importance of preventive medicine. And I feel that this is the most important aspect for our society, is cultivating a culture and a supportive framework for every child that prevents the problems. And we're in the United States, we're dramatically failing at this. Something as simple as the fact that children learn sense of self, emotional self-regulation, concentration. They learn so much from the simple act of eye contact and watching their parents' eyes interact with others. And we have now an epidemic of parents who are looking primarily at a phone screen and not at their children and not at other people. This is turning, it's not going to turn, it is turning into a lot of social problems with being able to socially interact with others, empathy, being able to empathize with others, that childhood eye contact. If you look around and you see little children whose parents are looking at their phones, you'll see them struggling to want to be what the parents are looking at. Preventive goals. Supportive is once the child is going through these neglect issues, through these problematic issues, supporting them to try to correct those issues. Rehabilitative is probably the most difficult and one of the most least likely for success. This is after years of problematic social home and self-regulation, and trying to correct that is very difficult. That's when we get into older children and trying to undo things that were done. Very, very difficult at that stage. So my suggestion is focus on societally focused on preventive. But of course, so child's counseling works in all three of these areas. So you look at the child and you say, okay, are we looking at a healthful child that we want to keep from the risks? Are we looking at a child that's in the risk that we want to support? Or are we looking at a child who is already been subjected to these damaging situations? What is counseling? It's the practice of professional counseling, the application of mental health, psychological, or human development principles through cognitive, affective, behavioral, or systematic intervention strategies that address wellness, personal growth, or career development, as well as pathology. Well, okay. It doesn't move me. Let me think. When you are a counselor, you are making a genuine, honest, authentic connection with a young person. You are looking at them in a way that demonstrates how the child will come to look at themselves. You are asking them questions that the child will eventually come to ask themselves. You're demonstrating ways of being, ways of reacting, ways of thinking, ways of feeling, and a curiosity, and ways of being passionate. You're demonstrating for that child all of the things that you would like to see cultivated within them. There's my definition of counseling. There's some more very objective ideas. Yeah, when the child comes in, I focus on family, which is conjoint therapy. That means you see the family together, and then you would also see the child alone, and you want to, when you're talking with the child, you want to know their feelings about life and how they feel. Sometimes, as you'll see in play therapy, this will be not verbal. It'll be done through drawings, etc., or play with figures, as we'll see in sand play. Where would the child like to be? What are aspects coming to have the child articulate and express things about themselves that they would like to change? And this is possible to do with children. It just takes first it takes trust, and the child, and some children, when you find one size fits all counselors aren't true. Some counselors click with children, other children and counselors click. That it's you have to find the right relationship, and if that relationship clicks, magic can happen. Plans to reduce discrepancy between first and second area. Well, when we look at problems that children face, we can look at these in categories. So we can have interpersonal conflicts. That means interpersonal. That means not getting along with other people. You have intrapersonal conflict. That's an emotional conflict with the self, within the self. Lack of information about the self. So this is being alienated from the self, not even knowing who one's is. Lack of information and environment. This is not uncertainty, unpredictability. Imagine the difference in this area between growing up in a household where there's an abuse situation happening, and the child knows every day that they're consistently going to be treated poorly. Compare that to the inconsistency of a child who grows up in a situation where one day is a good day, the next day is a bad day. One day the parent is loving and kind, the next day they're abusive. That's the kind of information that children need to understand about their environment that they're in. Um, and children don't have the access to that information. So learning information about their situation and learning skills to deal with that their particular situation. This is the goal here. They say is to get a child from -5 to +5. And you see these four categories in quadrant 1, 2, 3, and 4. We have these described here. I took that. Okay, I didn't write that out. So in the first quadrant, we have individuals who are working on finding a purpose in their life and finding ways of increasing skills to solve problems. This is like high-end, easier, I should say, child counseling, high-functioning counseling, and even no counseling. In the second quadrant, we have a high sense of purpose, a motivation, but a very low ability to function in the environment, to function in society. Number 3 is a very difficult situation where there's no sense of purpose and no problem solving, and this is childhood depression. And number 4 is no sense of purpose but has a great ability to solve problems, maybe intellectualize their problems, etc. So these are just 4 broad categories of understanding these categories on a chart. Of course, finding a purpose is quite a big part of finding out who one is, their purpose here. So there's a bunch of different health professions, mental health professions. Counseling is what we're studying here. You have psychologists who do more testing, psychiatrists who would do more pharmacological interventions, social workers who look at the day-to-day, daily life of the situation, marriage and family therapists, which I think is very much a part of counseling, as we'll see, treating not the child as the problem, but the entire family as a functioning whole. And then you have things like criminal justice, juvenile justice workers. You can, as a counselor, you're going to provide services, maybe in the community, like at a drop-in center or a child counseling, child care center. You could be going to their homes, mobile therapist, or you could have an office where they come to you. You're going to be offering ideas for family supports systems, maybe group counseling for family members, etc. All of these things, including the individualizing care for each child.